there is a palpable difference now between the Rippaverse and Ethan Van Sciver's CyberFrog verse, if you want to call it that. And I know there's some people who are going to joke and say, well, yeah, I mean, one of them is publishing books on the regular and the other one is not. But the real thing that I think differs is in the sheer lack of vision that exists on the Rippaverse side. And to exemplify that, I want to highlight the fact that when Eric July came up with the character of Gooding, he never gave Gooding a first name. Writer Mike Barron, who took over and wrote Gooding the Polymath after Gooding made his debut in ISOM #2, it was Mike Barron who came up with the first name Cato for this character. When I heard that, I started to realize something about the Rippaverse that I assumed was not the case. And that is, there really was no plan to this whole universe. I mean, there might have been a plan as far as rolling characters out, that ISOM was going to introduce Alpha Core and Yaira, and then maybe ISOM #2 was going to introduce Bloodruth and Gooding, and then, you know, as you go forward, more and more characters would be introduced. But that's really it. There was no story, no ideas behind these characters other than just bare elements, just stick figures in terms of how they were fleshed out. If you wanted to look how these Rippaverse characters were fleshed out, you'd be seeing nothing but skeletons for the most part. ISOM, sure, there's much more to ISOM than there has been to any of these other characters, but as far as the character of Brian Solari goes, as far as the character of Yaira goes, the surprising thing is not that the writers of those respective books, Chuck Dixon and the Soska sisters, have had to fill in the blanks. And same thing with Mike Barron on Gooding, that they had to fill in the blanks. That's to be expected. But the idea that there were so many blanks of such wide scope, it was as if, let me just come up with a basic idea. I'm going to plop it on the page, get a character design for it, write a few dialogue balloons, and that is going to be the character, and hopefully someone else will take it from there. And that really is all the Rippaverse has amounted to for the most part. It has been Eric July coming up with some bare bones, a framework for the Rippaverse, and then letting other talent try and hang their clothes on that framework. Contrast that with Ethan Van Sciver's work on CyberFrog. CyberFrog is a multi-decade story where he's got old source material that, you know, he's already published in the past, but that source material is not canonical anymore. And now he's developing kind of the latter or middle, I guess, portion of CyberFrog's career, because I suspect, you know, this Vespa's invasion is kind of going to be the before and after point of CyberFrog's career, with everything coming before, you know, being the province of various other titles. But the main CyberFrog storyline is going to progress through Red Extermination and Green Supremacy, and then on into the future. And not only is he beginning to expand out from his core story, because right now he's got CyberFrog Blood Honey, which kicked off his canonical series. He's got Wrecked Planet, which continues the story. He's got Dark Harvest, which is going to be debuting in a Last Chance campaign. And by the way, if you passed on Dark Harvest thinking that Dark Harvest was going to be a trivial addition to the CyberFrog mythos, according to Ethan Van Sciver, this thing has been expanded and developed way beyond its original scope. Because back in the beginning, when Dark Harvest was first offered, the idea was that he was going to do a 4 or 10-page story, and that was going to be the only original material. And then the next 10 pages were going to be the first 10 pages of CyberFrog 3. So Dark Harvest was originally intended to be more like a CyberFrog preview book of Volume 3, Red Extermination. But it's not anymore. The thing has gone under multiple metamorphoses until now. It's finally ready to go to print, and it is an independent story in itself that connects CyberFrog 2, Wrecked Planet, with CyberFrog 3 in what he says is a very meaningful way. You don't want to miss this installment of the CyberFrog storyline. So I'm just telling you, if you have not picked up CyberFrog Dark Harvest and you are looking to pick up Red Extermination, you need to get Dark Harvest, or else you are probably going to be lost when you start on Red Extermination, whenever that comes out. Now, all that being said, when Ethan Van Sciver came up with this idea for CyberFrog, one of the things that he told his audience and made clear was that he was doing it somewhat as a commentary on his own life, his own experience in the comic book business. In effect, he's kind of like CyberFrog himself. And it was, I think the way that he put it was that he was kind of asleep at the switch and doing work for the big two for, say 2 decades. And this is represented in the comics by the 2 decades that CyberFrog has spent in suspended animation. So that now that he's come out of suspended animation, to come out of working for the big two after being really kicked out of working for the big two, he is now horribly aware of how the Vespas, who represent the SJWs, have taken over the comic book industry the same way that the Vespas in the comics have taken over the world. And so CyberFrog is really a commentary on the state of comics. And so he's got this grander vision for CyberFrog that you may not see if you're just reading it at the surface level. Now, those of us who have been, comic book readers for a long time are going to see certain parallels. We see the Superman parallel from the beginning of Blood Honey, where he's, his rocket ship is rocketing to Earth past a giant red sun, and it's like, hey, I can tell the Superman imagery from here, and his status is kind of Earth's Messiah, the same way that Superman was a kind of messianic figure in the tradition of Moses from the Bible. You can see those themes that are running through it. And so now that he's actually bringing more titles than just CyberFrog into the mix, he's got Lynx coming out, which is the story of a girl who was born at the time of the Vespa's invasion, if I'm not mistaken, so that she's about 20 years old at the time of her book. And so she's never known a world without the Vespas ruling over it. There's also CyberFrog 1993, The Diary of Heather Swain, which is a title that's going to explore the relationship between Heather Swain and CyberFrog in his first years. And then there's CyberFrog Frog Meets World, which is also going to be a chronicling of his earlier adventures in the CyberFrog universe prior to the Vespa's invasion in 1998. And when you see how all of this is going to be his commentary on the comic book world, how things were back in the day when he started and when he was working in that world, and how things are now, and what we have to do in order to take that comic book world back from the people who have perverted it. There is a much grander vision in the CyberFrog universe than anything that is coming out of the Rippaverse. Now, granted, we do have this new title, The Great War of Separation, which is the latest book coming out of the Rippaverse, and this is supposed to be the Rippaverse's own origin story, which makes the fact that they've only sold 5,000 copies of this book so far massively pathetic. It is horrific when you think about the fact that you have got this book has been stated to be the origin of the Alpha Core characters Brian Solari and Braxwell, and half of the people who bought Alpha Core don't care. What the heck? I mean, you remember what the biggest question that people were asking about Isom in the beginning? It was like, how did he get his powers? What is his origin? Where did these powers come from? Blah, 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 blah. And now you've got an origin story for one of the Rippaverse characters, at least for Brian Solari, and I presume Braxwell, since they were operating around the same time. Nope, nobody cares about it. So my point about the Rippaverse was really that you've got this great war of separation, but aside from maybe one or 2 points that were offered by Eric July, I don't know that he contributed really anything out of his own mind to this. Chuck Dixon is the one doing the heavy lifting of doing the writing. So, how much did Eric July actually contribute? I'm really curious to know that. I mean, what is the story of the breakaway, or Texas's breakaway, supposed to be? I don't know that Eric knows. I really don't, because if he doesn't know one of his own characters' first names, why the hell would he know any details about any of these major plot events that he's put together? I mean, just look at Yaira for one thing. I mean, how much of that actually came out of his mind? How much of that was entirely the Soska sisters? When it comes to Bloodruth, how much of that has come out of his mind? And how much of that is the Soska sisters' creation? I'm really starting to get curious about anything that he's given over to other writers to do. Because think of how Chuck Dixon wrote Alpha Core in such a way that it was almost contradictory to the characters that Eric had established in ISOM number 1 and ISOM number 2. If you read ISOM number 2 and you read how Brian Solari talks, and then you look at Alpha Core number 1 and you see how he talks and acts there, you're looking at 2 different characters. You're looking at people who have 2 entirely different personalities. And the same goes for Yaira number 1. If you look at how Ingrid Valdez is completely deferential to Brian Solari and thinking he's great and calling him sir and all that kind of stuff. And then you go over to Alpha Core number 1 and she is all up in his grill like the entire time. You understand these are different characters that are being written here. These are not the same characters, just being written a little bit different. And Variant 47 says, ISOM number 1 story was vague and needed separation war backstory in it. It's too late now. It wouldn't be too late if they'd taken the time to give it a little bit more of an overhaul in that Rippaverse Trinity book. I mean, I know they've taken time to like redo some of the artwork in that thing, and oh, I am going to love taking that book apart. I'm just kind of shocked by how threadbare the whole Rippaverse concept is, because I was expecting that Eric July would have at least a vision for the first issues of each of his individual comic book properties. You know, I thought that he would have a plan for what Alpha Core was going to do after ISOM number 2. I thought he was going to have a plan for what Yaira was going to do for Yaira number 1, but he didn't even get any story credit for any of those. He at least is getting story credit for this great war of separation. So I'm assuming that some of the ideas are coming from him, but how much and what and how strong are these ideas and how much maybe these ideas should have been tossed out the door, like, you know, making Brian Solari a general. Oh my God, really? And for Chuck Dixon to have to suffer under that. I mean, I gave him a lot of crap in my little short where I was talking about how, you know, has Chuck Dixon even read Alpha Core number 1, given that he wrote Alpha Core number 1? Because you would not make Brian Solari a general. This guy is like a grunt, if anything. And he's supposed to have been a commander at some time. I mean, unless one of the side effects of his powers is like he's Charlie in that movie based on Flowers for Algernon, where he just gets dumber over time the more powerful he gets. Yeah, Brian Solari, I mean, he crashes the helicarrier at the end of Alpha Core number 1, and it's like you nearly killed the damn city. Why on earth would anybody have ever made this guy a general in any kind of army? It's almost like Eric doesn't know how to take this in another direction either, because if I were Eric July and my original idea was that Brian Solari was a general working in the United States Army who then defected to the Texas Army and became a superpowered person there. If I were Chuck Dixon, I know that I would have pushed back on that, saying, okay, well, that's not really consistent with the way I wrote him in Alpha Core number 1. Shouldn't we like change gears so that he's more of, you know, just kind of a private or sergeant at best who gets called up to submit himself to these experiments, because a general isn't really going to submit himself to whatever experimental treatments are going to make these people into accepts. That really wouldn't make it any sense to have a general be the one to do that. I mean, the generals are the strategists. The generals are not the blunt force objects like Brian Solari himself is. But either they had that conversation and Eric said, no, just write it the way I said, which, would be completely consistent with his ego. Or Chuck Dixon just basically said, hey, as long as you're paying the checks, I'll write whatever the hell you want and within whatever constraints you want. I mean, which could also be the case. I have no confidence whatsoever that any of these writers or artists working for the Rippaverse on a contractual basis, on a work for hire basis, feel any obligation to turn in their A game. And I know some of them have said to the contrary, things like, I don't let anything leave the house unless, it's A quality. Like, really? Because your definition of A quality may be different from mine, or that's just not the case. The threadbare nature of the Rippaverse is what makes it so much less appealing to me. There is no full concept. I mean, even the Great War of Separation is an appeal to the past. This is the Rippaverse's past we're talking about. The Rippaverse's future is being made more in comics like Yaira #2 and ISOM #3 and Norfolka #1 and the next Gooding series and Horseman and such like that. But we have no idea where that's going either. We have all these disjointed comic books spread out. Like, pick a card, any card. Hopefully you'll like one of these books and keep buying it. But there's no universal thread making any sort of connection. There's no grand villains. There's no grand plot to the Rippaverse that I thought there would be. At least there isn't right now. Of course, everything's open to change, because when ISOM #3 comes out, maybe we'll find out that there's some grand overarching enemy. I mean, at the end of ISOM #2, we saw some kind of deviling leader who is apparently, the ruler of some hell in a pocket dimension or something like that. And maybe that character will have some kind of overarching importance to the Rippaverse. But I don't see it so far. And maybe Norfolka is going to be what ties a lot of these things together. I mean, one of my favorite comic book universes, there have been a couple. They've all had general goals in mind, like the editorial staff of that comic book company had an idea that they were heading towards, had some grand crossover that would, once they had established all of their initial comic book characters, then they would bring them all together in a way that made sense. And from there, you could figure out, okay, what were the consequences of this whole great big crossover? Like Valiant did with Unity. Valiant came up with like 8 different titles. It came up with Solar, Man of the Atom, Magnus Robot Fighter. Those were a couple of Gold Key properties. You had Harbinger, you had Exo Man of War, you had Rye, you had Shadow Man, you had Archer and Armstrong and Eternal Warrior. Those were the 8 titles that made up Valiant Comics at the time. And you could see how everything was kind of shaping together, and they all converged on this one major threat in a way that made it believable for all these different properties that were in like past, present, and future to cross over with each other. And then they all spread out, and you got to see the impact of that crossover. Same thing with Defiant Comics. When Jim Shooter got kicked out of Valiant and then formed the company Defiant, there was a crossover that all of the titles were heading towards called Schism. And by the way, if you didn't know this is something important. If you remember Schism from back in the day, how they had solicited that, but they never published it. There is a crowdfunding venture on Kickstarter, I want to say, where that is actually in the works now. They're going to actually release the Schism 4-part series all in one volume that was going to wrap up the first phase of the Defiant universe. And I've gone ahead and backed that myself. And I want to encourage anybody to back that themselves as well. In fact, let me look that up. Jim Shooter's Forgotten Cult Classic is being published 30 years later. Okay, there is a $61,000 $200 goal, and they have so far collected $29,000 or almost $30,000 towards that goal. So they're about halfway to the goal. They've got 22 days to go. I'm going to get, even though I'm probably not going to enjoy it terribly much, because I don't think like the Defiant universe was like the best things in sliced bread. It has its own kind of Rippaverse type problems to it, but it's just going to be fun encountering these old characters again. But they had a plan. That's kind of the point of what I'm getting at, why I'm even bringing up Defiant in the first place, is that they had a plan. They had an idea of where their comic books were going to go over the first year. I don't get the idea that Rippaverse ever had that kind of a plan. I feel like even in the case of ISOM number 2 and ISOM number 3, I don't feel like there was a plan. It doesn't feel like ISOM number 2 organically led from ISOM number 1. I think that either Eric had ISOM number 2 written as the conclusion to the ill-advised arc, and then the whole Bloodruth and Gooding thing was going to be part of ISOM number 3 as part of the beginning of the next arc involving the Devilings and stuff, or it's possible that he just didn't have anything written at all. So anyway, looking back at what I had originally published or in a video before, when I was talking about, which is more fun, CyberFrog or Rippaverse. Rippaverse, I was initially more excited about because you had all these properties coming out that were not, so it was not going to be just ISOM who were appearing, and they would be jumping off into their own titles, and you could get to see where all this stuff was going, where this universe was building to. And then now that we've had all of those characters making their appearances various places, except for Norfolka, which will appear at some point during this year, if all goes to plan, you find out there really is no plan for the stories that are happening in the Rippaverse. That he's having to rely on outside talent to direct where his company should go. And that he's relying on fan input more than anything else to direct where his company should go. What is the point of that? We don't want to just see our own ideas handed back to us in some, decrepit form. What we're looking for is a vision on the part of the creator. And that's what we're getting with CyberFrog. With the CyberFrog comics, even if you don't like absolutely everything that there is that comes out of the CyberFrog universe of the books and all that, that at least you are getting a creative vision that is unique to that creator's properties, that he's got a theme that is running through his titles, and he is going to be doing variations on that theme throughout the titles. And it makes me curious to see how these titles will develop upon those themes. With Rippaverse, I don't know, and I don't really care where any of this is going. And that's the worst thing about the Rippaverse. I cannot begin to care about where these thinly developed characters are going, because it doesn't seem like Eric himself, as the creator of these characters, has invested enough in these characters, except for maybe just a core set, like the ones that take the main stage in ISOM number 1 and 2. It doesn't feel like he's invested enough of himself in these characters to really communicate any life to us. What is he trying to say with these characters? What is he trying to do with these characters? And now that the Great War of Separation is coming out, where that is, I'm guessing, supposed to be some sort of foundational statement about the Rippaverse and what the Rippaverse means and all that, he's handed off the writing duties to somebody else. It's not even going to be really his vision that hits the page if Alpha Core is any indication, if Gooding is any indication, these characters are not going to be anything like what they should be.